For almost a decade and a half, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom has been out of power. Why were they lost in the wilderness for so long? And what's happened that they now have a great shot to take control of Parliament again in 2024? Joining us this episode is Claire Ainsley. She's the director at PPI of the Project on Center Left Renewal, which focuses on building a strong center-left both in the United States and the UK. She's also the former policy director for Labour leader Keir Starmer, who may become the next Prime Minister of the UK if the polls are accurate. Claire joins us for this episode to talk about UK politics. How did we go from Tony Blair's overwhelming popularity to Labour out of power for 14 straight years? What factors were the cause of Labour losing power, and how have they become more popular under Keir Starmer? And what is Keir Starmer's vision for the Labour Party in the UK, for the economy of the UK, and for the future of the UK as a country in Europe and in the world? We discuss all that and more, so stick around. As always, we appreciate all our listeners. If you want to drop us a like, a recommendation, a comment, all of those are appreciated and helpful. If you want to really support us because you love the podcast, you can do so by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Members get access to bonus episodes, our Sticker of the Month Club, our community Slack. They get in touch with local organizers, and much, much more. Please consider becoming a member today. Thank you to all of our members and our supporters, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Claire Ainsley. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so you are someone who's very, very plugged into British politics, obviously, and UK politics, and the thing is, a lot of our listeners are very curious about this, but they're not going to be quite as plugged in as you. So I think where we should start here is kind of the history of the Labour Party, at least recently, because Labour in the UK, as one of the two major parties, has had a pretty tough time of it the last couple decades. You know, there's a lot of success there with Tony Blair in the 90s. And then after that, it's just been one disappointment after another, it seems. And so I wonder if we could start there. What happened with kind of Tony Blair and Blairism, and why did Labour kind of crash so hard from such a successful period where Tony Blair was elected 3 times in a row, had commanding majorities at some points, to a period where Labour just couldn't win an election to save their life, it seems like?
You're right. Labour's been out of power since 2010. So the new Labour government, led by Tony Blair, Prime Minister, very charismatic, won a landslide majority in 1997. So in our system, it's pretty much a 2-horse race. So the Conservative government, which was then led by John Major, previously Margaret Thatcher, was so resoundingly defeated by Blair's New Labour in 1997.
Are you saying that the Liberal Democrats are not a serious political force?
Well, they did pop up interestingly in 2010. They did pop up as a potent political force because they ended up forming a coalition government, which is not how our system is designed. Our system is designed to give parties who get a minority of votes a majority that they can work with in Parliament. But after the new Labour government waned in popularity, lost the 2010 election, it wasn't really a big victory for the Conservatives. They couldn't command an outright majority, so they had to bring the Liberal Democrats into government. Fast forward to 2015, and when the country had to vote again, they voted for a majority Conservative government, and the Liberal Democrats were really punished for the role in coalition. But yeah, by and large, it's Labour versus the Tories. There's some interesting dynamics which we could go on to of some of the smaller parties and how they affect the main party's votes. But Labour since 2010 have basically been out of power. We've had general elections, which is where the whole country in England, Scotland and Wales goes to vote for their Westminster representatives. We've had elections in 2010, lost, 2015, lost. Brexit, the referendum to end all referendums in 2016, pretty much was something that Labour lost because they supported Remain on the whole. 2017, another general election loss, and then 2019, which was a really massive defeat for the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn, the very left-wing leader, was then resigned, and Keir Starmer took over, and things look very different in 2024.
So what happened? If Labour lost all these elections in a row on the back of Tony Blair's kind of resounding popularity, because like you said, he was swept in 1997 to huge acclaim and huge majority and then won re-election and then won re-election again. And if I remember correctly, he's like the only Labour politician who's been elected prime minister or has won an election as prime minister in like the last 50 years or something. And it just all disappeared. So I guess the natural question is, what happened to Labour? Like institutionally, what made them so unpopular immediately after a period of high popularity?
Well, you're right. Blair won 3 general elections, so 3 consecutive terms, and that is unprecedented in Labour history. They won in 1997, 2001, 2005. In 2007, Blair steps down. Gordon Brown takes over as Prime Minister and went on to lose the 2010 general election. But it's not so simple as a swap in leader. Labour declined in popularity from those big dizzy heights of that landslide majority, really had kind of extended honeymoon of like 18 months, 2 years, which is quite long in political terms. But I think expectations were sky high of this new, optimistic, hopeful period. And actually, I would say Labour lived up to quite a lot of that in power. They managed to deliver a stronger economy, but also invest in public services and put a lot of the redistributive power of the state behind some of those social initiatives. So their programme had many successes coming out of it. But as any party finds, the longer you're in, the incumbency factor takes its toll. It felt like Labour had kind of lost their footing in some ways. The war in Iraq was a huge domestic problem for the Labour Party, which started to chip away at their trust. And then, of course, the financial crisis, which affected all of our countries in 2007 and 8. And it was very much hurt Labour's record on the economy. And all told, they lost narrowly the 2010 election and then found themselves in the wilderness ever since.
I definitely buy that, there's some factors that are just going to be hard for Labour to get over. That you win 3 elections in a row, and it's very difficult to win a 4th because every problem that pops up that entire period is now blamed on you. And then you've got a global economic collapse, which can't really be blamed on the Labour Party or anyone in the UK, but obviously it's going to make them very unpopular. The war in Iraq is very unpopular at that point in time. But I still don't think that's not really a complete answer of why it's lasted so long. It certainly explains why Gordon Brown lost and why kind of the unpopularity started. But why has it taken this long? Because one of the things I see is that, people are continuously making fun of British politics. There's been however many Conservative Party prime ministers in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's like a rotating cast of just who's the latest clown to step up in some sense. And people love making fun of this. Theresa May didn't even, or no, who was the one who didn't even last as long as a head of lettuce? That was Liz Truss.
Liz Truss.
Yeah. But so with all this unpopularity, it still begs the question of, well, why isn't Labour winning then? If this is the state of the Conservative Party, why couldn't Labour step in at any point?
So Labour now in 2024, we're expecting there to be our next general election to take place this year. Labour are a consistent 20 points ahead of the Conservatives in the polls. Obviously, the polls are not the same as people actually voting, but Labour is at its most popular point that it's been at for any of that period. Other times there have been flips where Labour has been temporarily popular. But this is a really big sustained lead for Labour. So it does look as though things might be about to shift here in a big way. But that question of what did Labour do out of power is really fundamental. And you would get different answers to this. But I think that Labour in opposition from 2010 really onwards, it stopped being in tune with where the public was at. And that was a gradual process. It wasn't an immediate process, but Labour in power in those days of New Labour, and I would argue under Keir Starmer too, it aims to be the political wing of the British people. It aims to speak for people's just everyday mainstream, working people's values and their aspirations. And there was a point during the 2010s where Labour was getting further away from where that was. And in particular, Labour's reputation for competence on the economy never really recovered. So even when Labour pulled ahead under previous leader Ed Miliband on overall headline polling, we never really outperformed on the economy until Starmer and his Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves took over and really shored up Labour's credentials in that space. And then, of course, the Brexit referendum happened, which was incredibly divisive for both parties, but particularly for Labour, given the result didn't go the way most Labour folks wanted it. And lots of traditional Labour voters voted to leave the European Union. And then at that time, Labour had elected a very left-wing MP called Jeremy Corbyn, who was part of what's known as the Socialist Campaign Group, which are a kind of party within a party of the Parliamentary Party. He was elected democratically and fairly to become leader. And he was very much of the left and, in my view, far away from where the mainstream of popular opinion was, and didn't have a credible programme for government, wasn't seen as having a credible programme for government. And Labour were really punished for that in 2019. So the story doesn't start with Corbyn, but he was like the worst possible answer, in my view, for us drifting away from the public, was we should have rooted ourselves back in the centre at that point. We went the other way and we've paid the price for that.
Yeah, you really can't tell the story of Labour in the last 15 years without, mentioning Jeremy Corbyn, obviously. He's a central character there. And it really does seem like there's two wings here. One wing that says we want to be the voice of the people, and what the people want is just a helping hand. They want some help. They want to be protected from certain parts of society or economy. They want something to support them. But that they don't want a revolution. They just want some help. And the other wing of the party very much says, no, what the people want is revolution, and we're going to give it to them. And I think we've seen that, at least in my biased opinion, you can tell me if I'm wrong, one of those visions is just broadly more correct than the other one. And I don't think that, by and large, the British public actually wants some kind of, deep down socialist revolution.
I think they clearly don't. Otherwise, they could have voted for it, campaigned for it. There is just no prospect in which that kind of type of socialism has broad appeal. Within the Labour Party, I would say the mainstream of Labour opinion is people do want quite fundamental economic and social change, but they're much more evolutionary in the way that you might get there. So I certainly think their ambitions of the mainstream of Labour is to have a fairer society and economy. But what you saw happen after in the run up to 2016, where Corbyn was then elected, or 2015 when he was elected leader, was that there was a kind of a group which was much to the left of where that mainstream of opinion was. And it was like they'd sort of taken over the Labour Party, and it didn't really look recognisably like it did before. And they're people often who have had the same kinds of views for many, many decades. They would proudly describe themselves as socialists. They're not broad-based in the sense that Labour is described as being a broad church, and therefore their views were much amplified. Many more members joined the Labour Party. So under the previous leader, it had become much easier and cheaper to join the party. And many people came into the party who weren't really Labour first. They were Corbyn first. They were left-wing, and that's who they kind of associated with. And Labour's kind of a moderate, in its essence, I think, is quite a moderate type of party. So it didn't look recognisably like it did before. And many people were very unhappy with the direction of Labour. Some MPs actually left the Labour Party completely. Others stayed, but they stayed because they knew that this wouldn't last too long. So it really was a pretty unhappy period for Labour, and it's not surprising that in 2019 we were punished for it. Interestingly, in 2017, Labour actually under Corbyn, got a better vote than expected. Broadly, I think it's because Theresa May, the then Conservative Prime Minister, ran a pretty terrible campaign with some controversial policies that they hadn't laid the ground for. But it was interesting that there is an appetite out there in the country for left of centre on the economy, for sure. But by 2019, people didn't think Labour and Corbyn had the credibility to deliver it. And of course, both those elections we lost.
I have to ask like a sideline question here, but you said Labour tries to be a broad church. Is that a common saying there? A broad church is like a welcoming group, kind of?
So I've definitely heard the phrase broad church be used about the Labour Party. Whether people find us a welcoming group or not, I don't know. I would hope so.
I love that. I mean, I love that because like here, I'm used to saying the Democratic Party is a big tent. You know, that's kind of how maybe that's the American spirit of like, you know, our religious revivals were always on the prairies, you know, in big tents, and people would come from miles around, and or maybe it's because our politics is a circus. I don't know. Maybe that's the big tent.
Maybe that's it. And you need
a broad church. I love that.
So broad church and big tent are getting at the same. They're getting at the same idea, which is the idea of the Labour Party, which is that really its founding was from the organised labour. So the organised trade unions who knew they needed a political voice, not just an industrial voice, and the kind of liberal intellectual traditions of the Fabian Society and others. And the merging of those two streams, 120 years ago, was the formation of the Labour Representation Committee as it was, and then the Labour Party. And as time has gone on, it's got broader as society's changed. So we have business representatives and business groups. We have Labour Digital. We have lots of different interest groups that come together. And there has generally been an accommodation of the kind of socialist left, not the revolutionary left, but a socialist parliamentary tradition, and this more the kind of Labour right, and then what you'd call the soft left. But it wasn't really until Corbyn that you had the socialist lefts in charge, and perhaps found it not as welcoming a group. And certainly for the Jewish community, who did not find Labour at that time a welcoming group. And we've had a really poor track record on anti-Semitism, that the country's regulator on equalities found the Labour Party in breach of our legal obligations around anti-Semitism, which was a shameful episode. That is something that we certainly weren't a broad church then.
Only more relevant today than ever, you know, because of unfortunately what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But you know, I want to ask something, because we're going to switch to talking, you know, less about history and more about kind of the current year and what's happening right now. But before we get to the current year, I do want to ask about my perception of this is that it's such a shame that Labour has kind of wandered in the wilderness here, that it went through the Corbynite phase, because it seems like it's not like the current Conservative Party is this electoral powerhouse. It's not like they actually have all these brilliant thinkers and brilliant strategists. And, you know, normally if a party has held power for almost 15 years straight, you assume that they are doing something great and correct, and they must really be representing the people in some way. When Margaret Thatcher and John Major, I think, combined for like 17 straight years of Tory government, certainly you could disagree with Margaret Thatcher, but she was tapping into something. There was something genuine there that people connected with. And similarly with Tony Blair, even if you don't like Tony Blair, he was connecting to something. But the current, you know, the Tories have been in power for like 14 years now. And it seems like it's just kind of one bungled episode after another. And it's like, you know, it just smells like this lost opportunity to me. I'm saying this as an outsider, so you may have a different opinion, but it just seems like just the biggest shame that like this parade of of weirdos and clowns has been able to keep the Labour Party out of power.
I think you're right, but I think it's also reflects something that Labour should reflect on themselves. Like, we've been in existence for 123 years. We've only been in government for 30 of those years. So we are not very good at winning elections, which puts Tony Blair's achievement even higher as something that hasn't been done before, and I hope will be repeated in the future, but we don't know. The Tory party, this version of the Tory party, it's really changed over the last few years. So it has been more stable than it is now. The Brexit referendum was kind of positioned by them as resolving a tension, but all it did was really kind of throw open a whole load of other internal tensions in the Tory party. So they have done, I think, overall a very bad job. And you can look at that objectively and people don't feel that they've done a good job. But this chaotic episode, really post-Brexit, has been from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to now Rishi Sunak. This is it feels like it's the end of a government that deserves to be booted out. And it's to Keir Starmer's credit that the Labour Party looks like it is a force that people now want to vote for. But you're right, that is to Labour's reflection, but it's also because the governing party has imploded in such spectacular terms.
All right, so let's talk about Keir Starmer. You've obviously worked with Keir Starmer and for Keir Starmer, and you know how he thinks to some degree, I would say. And I think a lot of people are wondering, especially people who are not from the UK and don't follow this day to day, how is Keir Starmer different? You know, how does he compare to Jeremy Corbyn? How does he compare to Tony Blair? How does he compare to kind of the past of British politics? And what are his ideas for the future? And how would he define himself as a member of the Labour Party? How does he want the Labour Party to move forward? If he's in this great position and Labour Party is up by 20 points and he is a huge favorite to become the next prime minister, you know, it hasn't happened yet, but we can all kind of see where things are pointed. What does he think about, you know, what Labour should be and what, you know, left of center politics should be in the UK?
So Starmer is pretty different to Jeremy Corbyn in almost every way, I would say. He has positioned the Labour Party under his leadership far more towards the centre ground of public opinion and of British politics. And research has shown that that's where the public now view Labour. They view the Labour Party as much closer to their views on all the important issues: economy, environment, public services, law and order. They on the whole put Labour much more on the centre ground, and they perceive the Conservatives as to their political right. So the first thing is he's just much more of a centre ground politician and party than his predecessor. He sees Labour's mission as being about what's written as our clause 1 in our rule book, which is that we are the political arm of Labour. So we are the voice of working people in politics. So he talks about that very explicitly, about being the party of working people. And you could call it working class, you could call it, you know, it's a pro-business, pro-enterprise version, but it is on the side of working people, which is not how people perceive the Conservatives to be. He's come from fairly ordinary roots in terms of his background. Is from a fairly kind of ordinary family. He's become, and what he became known as, is a very successful lawyer, firstly in human rights, but also in Northern Ireland. And then he headed up the country's Crown Prosecution Service, which obviously is the head of taking all of the cases or prosecuting cases to court. So his background is law rather than politics. That gives him a bit of a difference to his colleagues. He only actually entered Parliament in 2015, which is relatively late. And in terms of the future, where he wants the Labour Party to go and where he wants the country to go, is he's really embraced, actually inspired by some of what Biden and the Democrats have done, but he's really embraced this notion of being at the forefront of clean energy, about transitioning to a new type of economy that is technologically driven, which plays to the assets of the country, but crucially that our economic growth that we fuel is driven by the whole of the country, not what we have had, which has been by London and the South East, primarily financial services. a much more equitable view of who contributes to economic growth. So there's lots more about him and about his politics, but that's it in a nutshell.
One of the things that's interesting there, and I think this is something that center-left politicians and parties all across the world kind of have to struggle with, is the idea that, Starmer doesn't want to be seen as Jeremy Corbyn. He wants to be seen as pro-business and pro-growth, that he's going to be good for the UK economy as a whole, but he also wants to be seen as the voice of the worker. The authentic working class person can trust him that he's on their side and he's going to be looking out for their bottom line and their values. How do you balance that in the UK specifically, to be trusted on the economy and trusted to produce growth and not, I'm not anti-business, but also to be the voice of the working class? Because sometimes those two things will be in tension. They don't always have to be, but sometimes they either are in tension or at least are perceived to be in tension.
Yeah, I think sometimes they are perceived to be in tension, but the nature of what it means to be working class in the UK is pretty broad-based, and he sometimes uses the phrase working class, but what he's really talking about is an economy and a politics that works for, excuse the kind of cliched phrases, but like ordinary people, as opposed to what people have seen over the last few years, where they have seen a Conservative Party which really feels like it's governed in their self-interest. So I think that there is a commonality between forward-looking businesses who want a stable business environment in order to operate in and to make sure that their investment decisions are well placed and they can be ambitious. But that goes hand in hand with having better wages for workers, more stability at work. And that's really what this kind of vision of a prosperous future is, and clean energy being part of that, but it not necessarily always being about the conflict between worker versus business, because in a sense, if all labour ends up being reduced to is how much are you going to redistribute the profits of business, then that isn't where Starmer wants to position Labour. He wants to position Labour as being about promoting economic growth, but crucially that growth that comes from a contribution from across the country rather than a narrow section. So for sure, there will be trade-offs, there's tensions when you come to employment rights and how far to extend them, wages in the public sector, which is a very live issue, and we've had lots of industrial disputes here. But fundamentally, that common view of how you generate a prosperous economy, there's a lot of alignment between business and workers about how you would get there.
So I think that point about economic growth is really important. And it's something Britain has been struggling with because, frankly, to simplify things, if a country doesn't have any economic growth, then genuinely a lot of decisions are very zero sum. If the country is not growing, if one group gets more, it must be because another group is getting less. That's math. And the way we normally deal with this is economic growth. And over the last several hundred years, economies have all been growing in the long term, and that's all very good. But the UK has really struggled with growth over the last decade. And, there are some metrics by which the UK's per capita growth is lower than it was several years ago. And the economy just doesn't seem to be growing. It seems to be a flatlined economy. Housing certainly costs have spiraled out of control. There's a lot of worry from economists and from kind of the policy making community that the UK is just stuck in this kind of no growth cycle. If you're going to, help working class people, you've got to grow the economy. What's the plan to make sure that the UK actually has a growing, robust economy from kind of the Starmer camp?
So you're right. The problems that we have of underperformance of the economy are fundamental to what Labour thinks about what it would do and what it's got the capacity and room to do if it's elected into government. And we've had this sluggish growth over the last few years. And partly the remedy comes in the analysis of what the problem is. And part of the problem with our sluggish growth is the response, the policy response that the UK had to the financial crisis of 2007-8 was to take huge sums out of the public balance sheet. So we had what was known as austerity. So we had a Conservative Liberal Democrat government who cut public services and public spending quite severely. That has had obviously knock-on implications on public services, and we can talk about their contribution to economic growth and why that matters. But pretty fundamentally, it's meant that our business investment, which has always been lower than some of our comparators, is really underperforming. And we've got this long-term problem of productivity that has not been resolved or addressed. Meanwhile, we have the pandemic and we have the deficit related to the pandemic. And actually, the UK, which has not had historically high taxes compared to some of our European counterparts, we've actually got a pretty high tax burden. So you've kind of got the worst of all worlds. You're being taxed more than comparatively you were a few years ago. Your wages have struggled to grow. We had a bit of growth last year in wages, but that was atypical for the decade. And the services you're receiving are much more strained than they were. So that kind of recipe, people are really feeling. Politics is not on the Conservative side, but it's also not helping to contribute to growth. And recently, the UK Conservatives introduced a tax cut, and they're desperately hoping that tax cuts can be their route out. I think it's very difficult to see how tax cuts tackle the fundamental problems of growth, which is a longer term problem of underinvestment, poor productivity, skills, and again, the contribution of public services and ill health, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I don't think they've got a plan to put the country back on its feet.
One thing I'd love to ask about in specific is kind of the housing crisis, because in America, we also have a housing crisis. I don't think ours is quite as bad as yours, which stuns me to say that somebody has a worse housing crisis than America, but London might be it if anybody has it. And certainly once there's a crisis in London, people leave London and drive up the cost of housing everywhere else too. And so housing, I've always called myself like a housing truther, in that I believe housing is like the fundamental cause of every problem in society, in that we just don't have enough of it. And, it causes people to not want to move as much, which makes the economy less dynamic. It means that young people won't take any risks, which, stifles entrepreneurship. It really fundamentally chokes the economy in so many ways. So many varied ways. There's no part of the economy that is unaffected by high housing costs. And so that seems like something you've got to be tackling too, if you're going to be tackling long-term economic growth. You can't have a long-term growing economy where you just don't add housing units, right?
Right. Housing is a big chunk of the problem. It is more that we have got really high housing costs in London and South East, but that would be less of a problem if our economy wasn't so dependent on London and the South East. So housing is a huge part of the problem and also the solution, which we could come on to. But it's also because our jobs and economy is so imbalanced that actually we've got plenty of housing. It's just not in the places where the jobs are, where the progression is, and where people want to live. So you've got a period over sort of 3 decades or more where we haven't had a really strategic approach to how we build our economy in a balanced way. We haven't had a strategic approach about how we should then have our housing and transport to meet that need, so you can have an economy that is firing from different places. What we've now got is the results of an economy that has really had lots of expenditure, including housing, being taken off of the public books. So there was a huge sell-off of public housing during the 1980s without the replenishment of the stock. So you then have, as you say, this real pressure point where you've got social housing, as we would call it, so state-supported housing. The stock is just completely inadequate for the scale of people who need it. Meanwhile, we've had to rely on private rented landlords to support and provide housing, who can charge a market rent, which sometimes the state, would you believe, sometimes it is the state that is actually paying for that housing or paying a contribution of it. And you've got a really warped market. And that's not even talking about home ownership, which is a common model in the UK. Lots of people do own their home and want to own their home. And actually, that's getting further and further away from people. So I don't think you can solve the problems of growth just through housing, but you can't solve it without a solution on housing either.
One thing that I think people will be curious about who are potentially American, most of our listeners are American, although we have listeners all over the world, but majority American, and naturally they will make analogies in the sense of, well, okay, the Labour Party are the Democrats of the UK, and the Tories are the Republicans. And, Jeremy Corbyn is Bernie Sanders, and Keir Starmer is Joe Biden. Or maybe he's Bill Clinton. Maybe Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were the same person. Certainly, even back then, even back in the 90s, people were making comparisons between Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. But there's this tendency to kind of just one-to-one analogy, these kind of things. And I'm curious, certainly there's some legitimacy there. There obviously are some similarities, but how do the parties, compare? How does Labour compare to the Democrats in the UK and how they address some of these problems? And if you want to even, how do UK's conservatives compare to conservative Republicans in America?
Yeah, I mean, those types of comparisons as a way of understanding the world are not a bad starting point. I'll be cheering on the Democrats, just like I'll be campaigning for Labour in the UK. So, broadly centre-left parties and the Conservatives are on the political right. But yeah, sure, there are lots of differences. And I think the culture and the social base of the Democrats and the Labour Party are different. Labour has certainly grown out of the British working class. That's its primary purpose, is to represent political Labour in Parliament. And it has a rooted link to the trade unions in the UK, which have formed a very kind of constitutional part of the evolution of the Labour Party, very practical. They still help fund and support the Labour Party, but also it's kind of cultural and social as well. Trade unions represent a much smaller part of the population than they did, or the workforce than they did, but it is deeply embedded in the culture and traditions of the Labour Party to be aligned to the trade union movement. So there is certainly there's some similarities, but I think our origins and cultures are somewhat different, and our electoral base is different. So a study that PPI did last year of the global Center Left looked at the social base of different parties, and actually the Democrats' base has shifted. It has shifted more to graduates, whereas the Labour Party is only going to win if it commands a majority of that kind of non-graduate base. So there are kind of differences between the parties. There's another podcast to be had on the direction of the Democrats. Like, PPI does not think that is a sustainable route for the Democrats to win big majorities in the future, that it should pivot to more non-graduates. But Labour Party sort of traditions are different. Broadly speaking, the US parties are seen as somewhat to the political right of the UK. And certainly the political right in the US has been seen, especially on social issues, as being much more to the right wing of the British Conservatives. But that remains to be seen. If they lose the election this time, there's the thoughts that they will drift much more into the political right, but maybe they'll be in their wilderness too.
It's interesting always kind of comparing which party is more left, Labour or Democrats, because I think it kind of depends on which issues you look at. If you look at, healthcare and redistribution, you would probably have to say that Labour has a more left-leaning kind of policy program than the Democrats do. But if you looked at, something like, LGBT rights or immigration, it may come out a little differently. But it's always tricky making those kind of international comparisons, I think. But it is, it's a useful starting point for people because nobody can be an expert on every single country's politics.
Yeah, and you're right. And much of that is shaped by the different kind of groups and forces on each of those respective parties. So I think you're right on health and public services. Labour would be seen to the left of where the Democrats are, but that is partly because we have the National Health Service, which was set up by the post-war Labour government, and it is treasured. It's under huge pressure at the moment, but it is treasured by the British people because we have a system which is that you're paying in through your taxes, but it is free at that point of need. You don't pay per visit, if you like, or per treatment. So that is seen as to the left. But to be honest, the British Conservatives are probably to the left on those issues as well, because that's what we've grown up with. You take some others on the economy, for example, the current British Labour Party is very comfortable with being overtly pro-business in a way that sometimes the Democrat Party can be construed as being somewhat anti-business or certainly anti-big business. That's not where the British Labour Party is. They're gone to Davos. They are soaking up the business meetings that they can have. They're sending a different programme out with business, but they're not afraid of being pro-business. And certainly on social issues, what you would call progressive in the US, where there is also an alignment with some of the kind of identity politics, which has become a newer force in both of our countries. There's much less acceptance within the kind of British Labour Party, certainly the leadership, of that direction on social issues than there is in the US. So I think you're right. I think it depends on the issue as to where the parties are positioned.
So I want to take a left turn right here and ask kind of a hypothetical question, because I'm just assuming that Keir Starmer at some point in the next year, whenever the election is called, is going to become the prime minister. But at the same time, it's not automatic. Just because we have a 20-point lead in the polls right now does not mean that will hold up. It would certainly be a surprise. But I'd love for you to kind of paint for me a picture. If there's going to be some shock and somehow the Conservatives hold on to government and just it's this shocking result, the polls turn around, how would that happen? Is there any realistic path to that happening? Would it involve a certain area of policy becoming really, really high salience in people's minds? How would it happen, if it would happen, that the Conservatives could turn this around?
So I think you're right that you can't take anything for granted, right? And a party that's track record of winning elections is the Labour Party's. We definitely will be campaigning right up until 10 o'clock on polling day when the polls close. So there is no complacency on the Labour side. And part of that isn't just diligence. That is because there is now a majority of voters say they definitely won't vote Conservative. But there's a lot of people who are still saying they don't know or they won't vote. And most of those are people who did vote Conservative in 2019. So the Conservatives are hoping that those people will go with better the devil you know, and they're hoping that the performance of the economy will improve. People will start to feel those improvements and they will credit the Conservatives with those. Those are three big ifs. But what Labour are really aware of is that they have to convert more of those people into voting Labour than are currently saying that they will. So I think headline polling intention, voting intention, gives you a bit of a warped view of what actually might happen. There are still quite a lot of voters who are sitting with some reservations about Labour, who may in the end vote Tory. They might not vote at all, but I hope they'll be persuaded. The other factor in all of this is, whilst we do have a two-horse race most of the time between Labour and the Conservatives, we have a number of other parties that play a significant role. So the Scottish National Party are actually far and away the most popular party in terms of the last elections in Scotland. And they have quite a big constituency of MPs in Parliament in Westminster. Now, they've seen their fortunes decline over the course of the last year since First Minister Nicola Sturgeon stood down. Labour is starting to see a comeback. So that could play out quite an interesting way. Reform UK are our most right-wing party. They're the most pro-Brexit and they're the most anti-immigration. And they are starting to really rise in the polls. Now, they're not going to be able to form a majority. They might not even get an MP. But what they can do is they can take votes off the main parties, mainly the Conservatives, and of course the Liberal Democrats, which kind of ebb and flow in terms of their support. They could be a challenger in the parts of the UK where they will give the Tories a run for their money, the South East and South West. The nightmare scenario for the Conservatives is they come under pressure from all of those different factors, and we don't know how that's going to go. So there is a path that the Conservatives could tread, but I think there's a lot against them as well.
It's worth noting for the listeners that the UK does use a first-past-the-post system, much like America, where you have somebody from a specific region, from Stratford-upon-Avon or wherever, and you elect one person from that specific geographical district, just like you would elect a congressman from a particular region of Texas or whatever. But it's unusual because, here in America, we've only got the two major parties, and no libertarian has actually won, or Green Party person has ever actually won a congressional seat that I'm aware of actually running under the Libertarian or Green Party. There's some Republicans who've called themselves libertarians. But in the UK, you still have that first past the post, but with this kind of multiplicity of parties where certainly the majority of seats are going to be held by either Labour or the Conservatives. But you might have 6, 7, 8 parties, in Parliament, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you might also see some Conservatives lose out to Labour because they've got a Reform UK candidate standing in their area, when if the Reform UK candidate hadn't stood, those voters probably would have voted Conservative. So Conservative Party headquarters will be desperately hoping that Reform UK does not stand in every constituency. Labour will be hoping that the SNP's troubles continue, because there is such a number of seats in Scotland that potentially could go to Labour. But there are, as I say, all I'm saying is there are a number of different variables. The biggest one is the performance of the economy. If people start to feel better, and also the attack that is going to come on Labour. So the Conservatives are really going for Keir Starmer personally. The right-wing media is putting him on the front page in terms of his, they're going through all of the cases that he would have been processing as part of the Crown Prosecution Service. And they're trying to do a big campaign to weaken Starmer personally. I think that potentially could backfire, but we don't know how people are going to respond to what I think is going to be quite an ugly campaign.
Just as another sideline, are there any Welsh parties that are similar to like the Northern Irish parties or the Scottish, the SNP? Are there any? Does that exist at all, or do Welsh districts mostly vote for Labour or the Tories?
So Wales is mixed as well. I mean, Scotland's been so striking because the Scottish National Party has basically usurped Labour as the dominant force in Scottish politics, and that's kind of wobbling at the moment. Probably democratically it's better for there to be a bit more of a balance than there has been. In Wales, for sure, there's a nationalist party called Plaid Cymru who absolutely have taken seats that would have otherwise been Labour. Welsh Labour is still has remained strong. They're in government in Wales at the devolved assembly level. And of course, the Conservatives took some seats in Wales as well in 2019. So Wales is also a battleground. And basically what I guess listeners need to know is take nothing for granted. The days where you could have looked at a map of the UK and predicted which constituencies based on their demographic, their class, their age, how they would vote, those are gone. Things have changed a lot in the last few elections, and it will certainly be an interesting election this year.
So we talked about kind of the nightmare scenario. What if everything goes right for the Conservatives? What if the economy starts to really pick up in the next year? And what if they manage to get some scandals to stick on Keir Starmer? And what if, I don't know, something like the immigration crisis, the boats keep coming over and the Tories are really able to like hammer that as a political point. At this point, I think there's kind of a perverse incentive where the Tories would really love for there to be more boats so that they can yell about it. But that's kind of the nightmare scenario that would swing everything towards the Conservative Party. What do you think is a more realistic scenario? What if that's what we don't want to happen? What is Keir Starmer's pitch to the English and not just the English, I should say, the British and even the Northern Irish people, I guess? What is his pitch that this is what you're going to get? We're not going to have a crisis here. We're not going to have scandals. Is it kind of just almost, to me, it seems like a pitch just for competence to some degree, like stop being embarrassed of your government.
Yeah. And like at a very basic level, there is nothing wrong with people voting for Labour because they are sick of being lied to and the chaos that the Conservatives have brought. It's hit our country's reputation, but most importantly, it's hit our finances. That disastrous budget that Liz Truss, Conservative Prime Minister, but one instigated, has absolutely hit people's mortgages. It's shot up people's housing costs. And therefore, this turbulence people are really sick of. So for sure, I think having integrity, honesty, stability, like those are good attributes. I think what Starmer's promising is something more. I think he's promising a decade of national renewal. So he's saying essentially this argument that turn away from the years where we've had low growth, or we've had problems with growth that are partly about our historic positioning, and they have been made worse by the underinvestment and extraction of public investment from the economy. He's promising this decade of national renewal, which will be, that's in his words, which is about this transition to clean energy, but about how you do that in a way where you invest in the economy in all parts of the country. And you don't just invest in public services, although we need that. We need that to make people healthier, get back to work. We've got quite a lot of problems of inactivity now. But that you really start to see people's skills aligning to the kind of economy we need in the future. We've had none of that kind of big vision, where is we going as a country? Partly, I would say, not just because of the Tories, but because of Brexit, it's kind of clouded a lot of that discussion. We've left the European Union now. We need an alternative vision of how Britain is going to prosper in the future. I think Starmer and Labour have got it. I hope they get the space to explain it and engage people in it over the course of the next few months.
I think that vision is really important. And, it's a shame to see from the outside that, this country that has had so many great cultural exports and so many great thinkers over the years has really turned inwards over the past decade. And, with Brexit and with kind of anti-growth politics and austerity and just it's become a more inward looking country, that is focused on weird internal grievances, it seems, and doesn't have that will to grow and really be a strong presence in the international scene. And Britain has always thought of itself that way, that it's an important country and that it should be, out there international, impacting the globe, growing and developing and innovating. And hopefully Starmer can make that happen, because it would be a shame for that retreat to be a permanent retreat, for Britain to just never again really want to be an important growing country.
So we have to make sure we don't mix up the lack of ambition of the Conservative Party with the lack of ambition of the British people. When you look at the news media in the UK, we'll often headline on international news. We are very interested in the world around us. We accept that our place in that has changed, as it would do over the decades. But the British people are ambitious for their places, for their future. I don't think they've had a political party in charge which matches that ambition. It is a political party which sought to resolve an internal tension about our relationship with the European Union with, I think, a misguided referendum, and now has spent the last few years making the country pay the price for that. And what I hope we see is us emerge out of this period. We have brilliant businesses here. We have fantastic universities, research centres. We've got workforces that want to be able to play that part again, but we don't have the political leadership we need. So I think Britain can find a new path. I don't think it's about going back to where we were. I think it is a new path. I think the world needs more of us who've got stable, responsible, outward-looking governments at this point of big jeopardy around the world. And I hope that is Starmer and Labour that are able to play that part as an internationalist kind of government, and a UK that can play that role.
So we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we're talking about, if they're interested in British politics, in kind of renewing the center left in a transatlantic way and not just an American or UK focused way. If they're interested in, the election coming up this year or in learning about the Labour Party, what would you recommend for them if they want to learn more about what we've been talking about today?
Well, this is a great starting point. And of course, I would recommend the PPI's stable of both podcasts and written work. So we've got 2 big reports out at the end of the last year, one about the US, one about UK International. The UK International report is called Roadmap to Hope. And that I wrote it, so that's a bit cheeky to recommend reading, but that's a starting point. For fans of podcasts, the good news is there are lots of really interesting podcasts around at the moment. So we are lucky enough to have the BBC here. So the BBC's Global Story, I'm a big fan of. For people particularly interested in UK Labour, there's a podcast called The Power Test, which is available on, I'm sure, all your platforms, and is about how the Labour Party might prepare for government, what its challenges are. And there are obviously kind of numerous British politics podcasts that are out there, but I would definitely go for my starting point to those. And if you're interested in Australian politics, there's also the Socially Democratic podcast, which is a podcast run by the Aussies, but similarly, we're really reaching out to colleagues around the world who have a shared set of challenges, but also some positivity about the future. So hopefully those are some starting points for your listeners.
All right. Well, I certainly hope that, in a year's time, we're doing this podcast again, talking about the new Starmer government and all the things they're doing. We'll have to, we'll book that a year from now and, fingers crossed, we will be celebrating.
Well, I hope so.
I want to thank my guest one more time, Claire Ainsley. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.